I call Denise Roach.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. I'm going to speak several times tonight, I think, on different parts of this bill, and I will phrase or refrain from getting too far into detail in the first part, in my first call. But I just want to remind the House what this bill was about, and I thank the member for bringing this bill to the House. Its first reading was passed in May last year, and it's been quite a journey, quite a ride since then. The bill then was a beacon of hope, is what I thought. It was designed to reduce the harm from gambling, to reduce the rorts that frequently occur around pokie trusts, to get rid of some of the inequalities that happen with pokie machines being concentrated in high deprivation areas. The Greens liked this bill because it gave councils and communities the power to cut the number of pokies or eliminate them altogether in the areas. It ensured that 80% of the distributable funds went back to the communities where the money was gambled. It did some work in attempting to phase out some of the more negative aspects of the pokie trusts by looking for a reorganisation of them and allowing councils or other transparently elected committees to be set up to allocate that money. It had the intention of removing racing as an authorised purpose where the funds could be distributed to, because it's always been very strange that since the mid-2000s there's been the ability for pokie gambling to fund another form of gambling, and in particular stakes for racehorse owners. It implemented, or was about to implement, some problem gambling harm reduction measures like player tracking and pre-commit cards. And that would have given some control back to gamblers, some ability for them to put some controls on their behaviour. And I take the point that Mr. Flavel made, that this has not been trialled. And this was going to be the first time it would have been, which would have been a brave new step for Aotearoa New Zealand. But what happened to the bill? Well, when it came back to this House for its second reading, it was gutted. And if we look at it, there are pages and pages, lines and lines, where those good intentions have been destroyed, where they've been wiped out. And it's been replaced with amendments from the government that basically will not make much difference to gambling-related harm whatsoever. Mr. Speaker, we changed our vote, Mr. Chair, we changed our vote at the second reading because the Salvation Army, the Problem Gambling Foundation, amongst other organisations, agreed that the bill would cause more harm than good, that the original intentions had been so warped that it would not be possible for any good to come from this bill. And that is a very sad state of affairs for any member to face with their first bill in its passage through the House. However, there are clauses. There is one clause in particular in this bill which will do more damage. And that was the amendment that the government has put forward, that pokies can be transferred and relocated from one venue to another if councils decided to put that in their gambling policy. Now, I asked specifically about this clause in the Select Committee because it came out of nowhere. There were no submissions on this clause. There was no other discussion about this clause. It just suddenly appeared. And what the answer to my question, which was, if a council already has a relocation policy, which means that they will be able to reduce the number of pokies in total when a transferal account occurs. Will they be able to do that with this clause in this bill? And the answer was no, they would not, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I acknowledge the SOP supplementary order paper from Carol Beaumont, which actually addresses this issue, and I thank her for putting that up, because it means that councils will be able to reduce the number of pokies if there is a relocation, if they decide that's what they want in their gambling policy. And I know that some councils have actually had that policy in the past, because together with Mr. Goldsmith from the National Party, I was on the gambling policy hearings of the old Auckland City Council when that policy was put into place. I'll also actually pay tribute to Mr. Mallard's and his SOP number 290, which actually insists that there be a reduction if there is to be a relocation of pokies from one venue to another. And he suggests that it should be 25%, and frankly, I agree with him. At least 25%, thank you. And I absolutely agree with that. And I think any reasonable person who was attempting to reduce gambling harm would also agree with that. The thing is, though, will this actually happen? Will pokies move from one high deprivation area to a low deprivation area? Because the justification for it in the Select Committee was that this would be an incentive. If they didn't lose pokies, they would automatically do it. But actually, if you look at why pokies are prevalent in high deprivation areas, you actually have to ask if it's going to happen at all. Because it's those high deprivation areas, those areas, Mr. Flavel, where there are a lot of Māori people living, where there are a lot of Māori people getting hooked on pokies and pubs. It's those areas that make the money for the gambling, for the pokie industry. And I remind this House that the figures show that 40% of the proceeds from pokie gambling that are distributed to communities comes from people who have no control over their gambling behaviour. I'm deeply saddened that the intention of this bill, which was to address the fact that people in high deprivation areas, particularly Māori, particularly Pacifica people, will still be targeted by the industry. And this bill will do nothing to assist that, and in fact it could well make it worse. There are over 18,000 pokies in New Zealand in pubs and clubs. There is around $856 million generated from pokie gambling for distribution, and that was the amount in 2011-2012, and I think it was fairly similar this year as well. That's an awful lot of money, and it's an awful lot of money if you consider that 40% of that came from people who couldn't afford it. Mr. Chair, we will be supporting many of the SOPs that have been put forward today. In particular, we will be supporting the supplementary order papers that deal with that are a first attempt, or another attempt basically, because this bill has not been successful, but the attempt to try and bring some transparency to the pokie trusts. The clauses in this bill that were designed to ensure that pokie trusts did not rot the system, that the distribution occurred elsewhere, has failed. And I think we have to recognise that. But Mr. Mallard's supplementary order papers that actually ensure there is transparency around how pokie trusts spend the money that they get, which is a goodly percentage, how they spend it, the restriction that Mr. Mallard has suggested in another of his supplementary order papers that puts a restriction of $100,000 as a limit on what trustees of those pokey trusts can earn is a great idea and another step forward to some transparency. Mr. Chair, thank you.
Carol Beaumont. Sorry, Carol, I didn't hear you call. Carol?